So I'll move a little bit away from the other presenters, although many of the issues I will be touching upon resonate with what others have already said. What I would like to discuss is how water is becoming increasingly global. So there's actually water is becoming global in two main ways. One is that water distributions are becoming the subject increasingly of the dynamics of the global economy. And the other one is that I think partly because of climate change, water problems are increasingly being perceived as global in nature with the emergence of a new global water regime. What I will do today is I'll focus on the first, how water distributions are increasingly becoming the subject of the global economy. And let me just give some examples. Although distributions happen as Joy also mentioned, they happen at local and basin levels. They are increasingly dictated by what happens in global markets. Just to give one example, the 5,000 liters of water that it takes to produce a hamburger is one. That I can go to my supermarket here around the corner in Delft to buy grapes that were produced in Maharashtra is another. Or mangoes. Today it was the open market in Delft, and it was replete with mangoes, and some of those were coming from Peru, grown on the desert coast of Peru. Those are all indicators of a globalizing water economy. Another example is the financing of large dams for the production of hydropower in the eastern Himalayas, which are financed under the Clean Development Financing Facility as part of mechanisms to offset northern carbon dioxide emissions. All these are examples of the globalization, I would say, of water. And what they entail, what I would like to focus on, is how many of these globalizing water reallocations happen through the transfers of water from lower value food crops to higher value commercial crops. The mangoes, asparagus, grapes I already mentioned. Such transfers are actually promoted by policies, water policies and national governments, because they are thought or they are seen to improve the productivity of water users, more crop or more dollars per drop. And they are also justified by the idea that since most water is used in agriculture, estimates have it that 70% of water is used in agriculture, the idea is that also most water savings should happen in agriculture. So water should be released in agriculture, and water in agriculture should be used more efficiently to save it and make it available to other users and users. These transfers from lower value food crops to higher value commercial crops are made possible, legally possible, through the drastic reformulation of existing water rights. And they are justified by the dubious characterization of existing uses as non-productive or wasteful. This is just one slide that illustrates what is happening in Peru with asparagus, the growth of the export of asparagus in Peru, which are grown on the desert coast. Here you see what this looks like when seen from the air. You can actually see it's a very interesting sight with some patches of green in an otherwise very dry desert. The water to irrigate these asparagus originally comes from the high mountains. And this is actually a table that I took from a student whom I supervised who did research in Maharashtra, Harriet Larrington Spencer, and she worked actually with Joy, with Sopecom. She looked at grapes, and if you look at grapes in the table, you can also see the same as with asparagus in Peru, how the production of grapes increased tremendously in India. Here another slide that illustrates this. The production of grapes requires a lot of water. This is a picture of also of grape production. So what I'm interested in, or what I would like to discuss, is what does this mean, this globalizing of water? What does this mean for questions of equity and for questions of equitable governance? For one, it means that agricultural water users in low-income countries are becoming connected in myriad and complex ways to globalizing flows of funds, expertise, commodity chains, and markets. These connections are justified through specific discourses and stories of progress and development, and make use of, while also reconfiguring, cultural differences and territories in ways that are difficult to predict. There's three questions that, there are probably many more, but three questions that I see emerging from this globalization of water. The first is a very straightforward one, is who are the winners and losers of these new water uses and allocations? And maybe more importantly, how to identify them and at what scale? The second is whom or where to demand more equity or justice, or who is responsible for water allocation? If water allocation is becoming global, one can no longer just go to the government to demand more equity. So whom to approach? And the third one, on what basis, if not identity or territory, to construct alliances for water equity justice, if these transcend national boundaries or watershed boundaries? Let me first go to the first question. And I use some examples that are that I took from a study done by Progressio with some other partners about the asparagus case in Peru. This research, it's a fascinating research. It shows how huge increases in water demand to support the production of asparagus are linked to negative economic impacts on small and medium-scale farmers. The asparagus are mainly grown by large agribusiness companies, and it contributes to water scarcity and inequity for some of the poorest communities in Peru, fueling social conflict and increasing their vulnerability to climate change. At the same time, however, around 40% of the population in the valley where the asparagus are grown are employed by the agro-export companies. So the asparagus boom has contributed to near zero unemployment in the area, providing jobs for many poor people. With this, I want to say that it's not that straightforward to identify winners and losers. A bit similar, but also quite different stories about grapes in Maharashtra that I'm sure Joy could be telling in a much clearer way than I can. Here, unlike in Peru, grapes are not grown by large agribusiness companies, but by smallholder and larger farmers, family farms. And you can see that some kind of processes of accumulation of water are happening by the export grape producers who are happy about the new incomes they are earning, although they're also complaining because they are becoming so much more vulnerable to the whims and fancies of the market. Here also, grape production creates employment opportunities which are not very secure, with very low wages. A feminization of labor is occurring. So there are lots of it's not very easy here also. It's not very straightforward here also to say, okay, these are the winners, these are the losers. And this is a picture of mango, another export product of Peru, which is again a family farm. And I just showed this picture to indicate that to identify winners and losers, it's very important to look at the precise tenure and labor relations that govern production, because these largely determine who wins and who loses, with smaller scale family farms presenting an entirely different scenario than large agribusiness production. So how to read these globalizing connections? Are these, as some would have it, stories of progress and development, increasing water productivities, incomes, employment, and foreign exchange? Or, as others would have it, Should they be read as new forms of capitalist expansion, predicated upon sometimes aggressive, but often very subtle resource grabs and enclosures of the commons? Of course, assessment or which story to choose depends on identifications, perspectives, theories, and scales. And what I think is important, whatever story one chooses, they should always do justice to the experiences of those living the changes. And perhaps the bottom line is the continued availability and health of the resource, water, and of the ecosystem of which the water forms part. In the Ika Valley, groundwater is heavily overexploited, and it's so there is a clear limit to the production of asparagus. And now already you see agribusiness companies moving elsewhere where water is more cheaply available. Let me go to my second question. With all this, if it is possible to identify the winners and losers, and if we can make an assessment of equity or inequity, where to go with demands for more equity? And I think what is important here is to realize it's not that water is not just becoming global, but also that water governance is in a way becoming head or centerless. So it becomes ever more difficult to identify whom to approach with demands or requests for more equity or justice. The ICA report, the Peru report, shows that the responsibility for the water problems ICA is facing lies in part with the Peruvian government. But largely, it also lies with the other parties driving the asparagus boom, many of whom come from outside Peru, including investors and retailers. Most of the asparagus grown in Peru go to the UK or to the Netherlands. So what to do, whom to go to? Can I, as a consumer, these consumer labels or these water labels, are these a solution? And so corporate social responsibility mechanisms and stewardship certifications. These are ironic measures because the standards are set by the dominant market players themselves, and they are all representatives of the major producers or supermarket chains. And there's very little these schemes can do to modify actual water flows. They can try and prescribe norms about rational water use, but actual water users hardly ever follow these prescriptions. My last question is, on what basis to construct alliances for water equity if one realizes that waters are globalizing? I don't have a clear answer here, and I think some of the others already tentatively proposed some possible answers. My only answer perhaps is that I think pragmatism is needed. So rather than quest for ultimate sets of general tools, guidelines, principles, or theories, so solutions perhaps lie in never finite agreements consisting of ways of doing, intervening, and making that come from somewhere and that go somewhere, but that always align with those that are experiencing water insecurities and water scarcities. So this is, and I think here it's important to engage in forms of activism that do not reproduce the very cultural differences that, from a perspective of equity, we actually would like to challenge.